Hey, everybody, welcome back to another week's exploration of various biblical items like psalms and or hymns. This week, we are looking at Psalm 100. Now, the caption that is present within my NRSV translation, and is probably present within a lot of different ones, is this is called a Psalm of Thanksgiving, kind of a caption that's listed right under the name Psalm 100. And what's interesting about that is that that is actually present within the Hebrew. It begins a melody of thanks, or a melody of thanksgiving. I actually looked at a different translation that showed or that indicated that this is a psalm for the thank offering. And I think that, while not necessarily accurate, is probably still a good idea. It gives a general theme that this short psalm, which is only 5 verses long, is indicating a need for joyful worship of the Lord. So that idea that this is for the thank offering is not necessarily specified, but would make sense. Side note, within the Hebrew or Jewish faith, there are different festivals that are indicated or aimed at times of thanksgiving and would include a thankfulness offering to God. Oftentimes, this would happen around times of harvest. And one of those major festivals that we do hear about within the scriptures is the festival of Pentecost. You may recall Pentecost from Acts chapter 2, post death and resurrection of Jesus. That's a big thing for New Testament. This, of course, is within the Jewish understanding or the Jewish culture. The festival of Pentecost is a harvest festival and would be a time that would include one of those thankfulness offerings. That is a side note, but worth noting. So, it is possible that this psalm was considered to be a song or part of a ritual for entering into this specific type of worship opportunity. Now, I'm speculating on that front, but in my mind, it kind of makes sense. It is plausible. I'm not saying that's the way it is, but it's plausible. A word now on the authorship of this psalm. Now, we've talked about this before in some past weeks with some different psalms, but it's worth noting again. A lot of the psalms are attributed to King David, whether or not he actually composed them or not. Back when we were looking at Psalm 23, I mentioned the idea of things within the scriptures being written pseudo-biographically. That is a big fancy word that basically means that someone would write something or compose, in this case, and they would act as if they are writing as a different person. Some big examples of this happen in the New Testament, and several of Paul's letters are considered to be written pseudo-biographically, aka someone else wrote them as if they were Paul. And I would say that if we think that all of the Psalms are attributed to David, this one is a really good example of one that would be written pseudo-biographically. But again, this is just a side note because nothing in this Psalm indicates that it's attributed to David as some of the other Psalms do. So this is kind of just information for you. But the reason that I say this is specific to verse 4 within Psalm 100, which indicates or utilizes locations that are part of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, the reason that this is important, history tells us that David did not build the temple. It did not exist yet. It was actually built by his son Solomon after David died. So it is likely that this particular psalm was composed somewhere in the window between David's death, which was roughly the year 900 BC-ish, give or take, and the destruction of Jerusalem, including the temple itself, by the Babylonian Empire in the year 586 BC. So that's a pretty big window for when this psalm could have been actually composed. And it was probably early in that time, probably, and would have been a part of temple worship. But again, I'm speculating on that. I don't actually know. Let's get back into the psalm itself. Within the idea that this psalm is part of a Thanksgiving worship or of some kind, the song includes instructions for us, specifically commands, whether they are intended to be taken literally or they're just a part of the structure of the song, indicating how do we come before the Lord to worship. And they express this idea. Make a joyful noise. Make the command. The make is the command. Make a joyful noise. Worship the Lord. Come into his presence enter his gates, give thanks. So we have these instructions of things that we are to do in the state of worship. And with the attitude of gratitude. That's sometimes cheesy, but it's accurate in this case. I want to make a little side note. The language within this, and specifically within the Hebrew, paints God as male. It does use male pronouns. Perhaps you've heard me talk about this before. I don't really tend to think of God as having a gender, but within the understanding at the time, within the Hebrew language, yes, they do use male language for God. So just want to make that little side point. In the midst of these commands, right in the middle of the psalm itself, there's one more command, and this one is not so much an action as it is more of an acknowledgement. Know that the Lord is God. Last week, as we talked about the doxology, I got into the Hebrew understanding of the word God, or Lord, or Yahweh, or Master, or all of this. We talked about the Lord, and when we see Lord, L-O-R-D, everything capitalized, and sometimes the font's a little bit different, that is the word Adonai, or also Yahweh. Same thing, just written differently. And then we have the word Elohim, which can mean God, or it can mean gods, like lowercase, or it can be heavenly beings. Well, in this phrase, know that Adonai is the Lord, or that Adonai is Elohim. Know that the Lord is God. So that translation is pretty spot on. There's recognition also within this verse that humanity is the creation of Adonai. He makes, not us. That's a pretty direct translation of the Hebrew. We belong to God's people and to God's flock, which he shepherds. And can't help but think that there's some echoes of Psalm 23 in there. So maybe that sounds kind of familiar. I kind of like it. It's definitely in there. With all of that being said, I want to come back to verse 4 now. I mentioned that earlier as evidence that this probably was not written by David because of references to the temple. And I want to get into that a little bit more. So we have in verse 4, enter his gates and courts. Now, there's a couple different possible meanings for gates, and then more on courts in just a second. Gates could mean either how we enter into the city of Jerusalem, aka the city of David, aka the city of God. It was a fortified city surrounded by a wall, and there were 8 entry points, 8 gates, which are still present in the old city walls, as they call them now. Now, I need to make a distinction. There's the old city, which marks the historically where the city of Jerusalem was. And but if you know your history, you know that was all destroyed at one point and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt. And so the walls that separate the Jerusalem proper, as we know it now, from the old city, the old portion, are about 500 years old, but are intended to as closely model the old city as possible. And there are 8 gates. So what that could be is enter into the city of God through his gates with joy and thanksgiving. And then there's the other part, enter into the courts. Now, if we combine these two things, that might point us towards the idea or the structure of the Temple Mount as a whole. Not just the temple building itself, but the entirety of the Temple Mount. The description of that area includes various courtyards as well as structures. And depending on who you were, would determine how deep into the whole overarching structure you could go. Gentiles could go a certain portion. Women could go, and children could go a certain portion. Men could go a certain portion. Priests could go a certain portion. High priest could go a certain portion. So depending on who you were, would determine how far into it, which courtyard you could get into. And of course, there was a gate that lied between all of them. So when we hear enter into his gates and courts, it could mean enter into the city, or it could mean enter into whatever section of the Temple Mount you are going into with joy and thanksgiving. So, interesting note there. Last thing I want to talk about is the ending of this, verse 5. And I appreciate verse 5 a lot. It's a recognition of God's favor. We hear that the goodness of the Lord, aka Adonai, if you remember we talked about that, is for always. God is always good, and God's faithfulness is to all generations. So that's kind of the two phrases that are recognizing and wrapping up the why that lies behind why do we worship the Lord with joy and thanksgiving? Well, because God is good and faithful to all people. And that, I believe, is an indication that we have a God that takes joy and delight in us. And so we take joy and delight in the Lord. And who is the Lord? Well, the Lord is the one who made us. We didn't make God, God made us. That's everything I've got for this Psalm 100. Hope that you have a great discussion, and we'll be back at you with a new topic next week.